I want to welcome everyone here, and without objection, the chair may declare recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today's hearing will examine the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed emissions rules, including those that seek to place strict standards on tailpipe and power plant emissions. Our subcommittee held a hearing on these proposed emission standards on the 17th of May. The committee invited Mr. Goffman to testify. The EPA refused to provide him or Sarah Dunham. Chairman Coleman and I were disappointed, to say the least, by the EPA's unwillingness to cooperate and subsequently sent a letter to the EPA Administrator, Michael Regan. We still moved forward with that hearing and invited other witnesses to testify. Our witnesses expressed concern that the industry would not be able to implement rules that, according to EPA estimates, would require electric vehicles to comprise 2/3 of all new car sales by 2022. According to the Biden administration, these new standards are the quote-unquote strongest ever. As clearly stated in our letter to Administrator Reagan, the EPA ought to be willing to come before members of Congress to answer questions about its proposed rules. In fact, the former OIRA Administrator Sally Katzen agrees. She testified last week and underscored Congress's role in oversight of the federal agencies and rulemaking process. So I'm glad that Mr. Goffman is here today to allow Congress to do its job in conducting oversight of EPA's proposed emission standards rules. During the May 17th hearing, we also discussed recent Supreme Court cases, including West Virginia versus EPA and Sackett versus EPA, that rein in EPA's regulatory overreach. However, as exemplified by these proposed rules, EPA does not seem to understand its legal purview. Last month, EPA rolled out what equates to Clean Power Act 2.0, a proposed rule that would drastically lower emissions for coal and gas-fired power plants. This is legislation by rule. The Supreme Court already ruled against the EPA and the first Clean Power Plan and stated the EPA did not have the authority to place state-level caps on carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. As 60% of our nation's electricity is produced with coal and natural gas sources, Clean Power Plan 2.0 would have severe implications for the security of the United States electrical grid. Yet the Biden administration continues to disregard Supreme Court holdings when it advances radical proposed rules at an unprecedented clip. The Biden administration and their leftist allies simply do not care. When you hire activists to become bureaucrats, you're going to get none other than bureaucratic activists. In 2015, in a speech under the Obama administration, the then EPA administrator and former Biden National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy said of this Clean Power Plan, and I quote, "This is a rule that actually regulates toxic pollution emissions from primarily coal facilities, and we think we're going to win because we did a great job on it. But even if we don't, it was 3 years ago. Most of them are already in compliance, investments have been made, and we'll catch up." So this is just very Machiavellian, the end justifies the means. And it's especially poignant. As stated by Gina McCarthy, EPA appears to not care about law and does not care about rulemaking, whether or not it's legal, as long as it can force compliance and investment outside the law. And this is dictatorship, not by the proletariat, but dictatorship by the bureaucracy. And our Democratic friends, because they agree with the goals, callously and carelessly look the other way when Congress is bypassed, the legislative process is ignored, and the rule of law is perverted. Agencies' actions that remove consumer choice operate on the assumption that federal government's unelected class knows best for its citizens, even more so than the citizens themselves. My wife has an electric vehicle because that's the choice that she made for herself and our family. I have a combustion engine vehicle because that's the choice that I made for myself and our family. It's about choice. The federal government shouldn't be in the business of regulating vehicles off the road or shuttering 60% of our nation's power sources while simultaneously stressing the grid with illogical proposals like banning gas stoves and electrifying school buses. The EPA cannot circumvent Congress or the law, try as they may. I look forward to this hearing and learning more about the EPA's process for rolling out these proposed rules, and I yield to the ranking member.
Ms. Bush, me right?
Ranking Member
Okay,
Bush.
all right.
From St. Louis.
From St. Louis, you're right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Deputy Assistant Administrator Goffman for being here with us today. St. Louis and I are here to talk yet again about the urgent need to tackle the climate crisis and protect human health by reducing polluting emissions. The subcommittee already considered this topic in the other hearing room just a month ago. While we have a different witness today, the science and the facts remain the same. Decades of scientific research proves that burning fossil fuels creates polluting emissions that enter the atmosphere and generate a greenhouse effect that dangerously warms our planet. These toxic emissions enter our lungs through the air we breathe and make us all sick. Pollution is nonpartisan. It impacts all our communities differently. The quantity of pollution entering our atmosphere is staggering. According to the Congressional Budget Office, and I quote, in 2021, worldwide emissions of greenhouse gases from all sources amounted to 40.8 billion metric tons. And the United States was, quote, estimated to account for almost 1/6 of that amount. As I explained last month, we only have a brief window to act to prevent the most severe consequences of the climate crisis. We know the health effects of air pollution fall disproportionately on Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. I would like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record an article published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on May 27th of this year.
Without objection, so moved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to that article, and I quote, about 4 million kids in the U.S. have asthma. The percentage of Black children with asthma is far higher than white kids. More than 12% of Black kids nationwide suffer from the disease, compared with 5.5% of white children. They also die at a much higher rate, end quote. These are the stakes. The health and safety of innocent Black children are being compromised by reckless environmental destruction and pollution. Alarming data from the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services shows, and I quote, Black children are more than 10 times as likely as white children to visit emergency rooms for asthma-related complications. This is unacceptable. Under the leadership of the Biden-Harris administration, the EPA is proposing tough yet attainable standards to reduce the polluting emissions entering our atmosphere. When we finally implement the EPA's rules, we will be taking significant steps to combat climate change. By making significant and long overdue reductions in the amount of pollution poisoning our air every day, we will be saving lives and we will be preventing illness and suffering. As we discussed last month, adoption of EPA's proposed standards to reduce emissions from heavy trucks would produce, quote, up to $29 billion in benefits from fewer premature deaths and serious health effects such as hospital admissions due to respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses. By the year 2030, adoption of the EPA's proposed standards for fossil fuel power plants would result in, and I quote, approximately 1,300 avoided premature deaths and prevent more than 300,000 cases of asthma attacks. And as someone who suffers with asthma, this is a good thing. During the last hearing, my colleagues across the aisle tried to distract from these essential facts. They claimed that the Biden administration was trying to hijack the auto industry and eliminate consumer choice. They also claimed these standards were unaffordable, as if getting sick in this country was free, or as if the climate crisis will not impose any cost on our businesses, our homes, or our schools. The reality is that Republicans' efforts to impede the finalization of the EPA's proposed emissions control rules would result in the dumping of billions of metric tons of pollutants into the air that could have been avoided. Republicans' antics would exacerbate the climate change already occurring, needlessly exposing our communities, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous, to the health consequences of pollution. I thank the Biden-Harris administration and the EPA for their work to address the climate crisis and make our communities healthier. And I thank Mr. Goffman for joining us today and for his leadership in this critical effort. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. I'm pleased to welcome our witness today, Joseph Goffman. Mr. Goffman is Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency. We look forward to hearing what you have to say on today's important topic. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witness will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. We appreciate you being here today for your testimony, and let me remind the witness that we have read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button in front of the microphone for you, and you're going to get green light for 4 minutes, and you'll get a yellow light for 1 minute, and then the red light if you could carry your landing and wrap it up. I now recognize Mr. Goffman for his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Bush, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for giving EPA the opportunity to testify before you this morning on our proposed emission standards for cars and trucks. The transportation sector accounts for the largest portion, nearly 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, and for significant levels of health-threatening air pollutants in the United States. Reducing these emissions is an EPA priority to ensure that Americans enjoy healthier lives. In April, EPA announced proposed pollution standards for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles for model year 2027 and beyond. The proposed standards align with commitments already made by automakers and commercial vehicle manufacturers as they plan to accelerate clean vehicle technologies in the on-road vehicle fleet. These proposals, which follow EPA's long-standing approach to setting car and truck standards under the Clean Air Act, would deliver dramatic improvements in public health, notable savings for consumers and commercial fleets, and increased energy security for Americans. If finalized, these proposals would mark a significant step towards improving air quality, protecting people's health, and addressing the climate crisis. These proposals would deliver these important public health benefits by achieving widespread reductions in harmful air pollutants. They would improve air quality for communities across the nation, especially communities that have already borne a disproportionate burden of polluted air. Motor vehicle pollution is linked with avoidable premature deaths and serious illnesses, including respiratory illness, cardiovascular problems, and cancer. In a single year, the proposals would prevent between 750 and 1,700 avoidable deaths, with the cumulative results over, say, 20 years being much higher. In addition, EPA estimates that between 2027 and 2055, the proposed light and medium-duty standards would reduce CO2 emissions by 7.3 billion metric tons. The heavy-duty proposal would reduce CO2 emissions by an additional 1.8 billion metric tons of CO2. Together, these reductions would be the equivalent to more than twice the total U.S. CO2 emissions in 2020. And they would strengthen American energy security by reducing reliance on 20 billion barrels of imported oil. The proposed standards would also deliver lower fuel and maintenance costs for families. The proposed light-duty vehicle standards would, on average, save consumers $12,000 over the lifetime of the vehicle. Under the heavy-duty proposal, EPA expects that truck and bus owners would see approximately $250 billion in savings associated with reduced fuel use and vehicle maintenance and and vehicle maintenance requirements with fewer repairs needed. Overall, EPA estimates that the benefits of the proposed light-duty vehicle standards alone would exceed their cost by at least $1 trillion. EPA developed the vehicle proposals recognizing the significant investments that Congress itself has already made in clean vehicle technologies through both the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we also recognize that industry itself as well has made investments in response to market shifts, technology innovation, and increasing consumer interest in electric vehicles. Since President Biden took office, the number of EV sales has more than tripled, while the number of available models has doubled. There are over 130,000 public chargers across the country, and that represents a 40% increase since just 2020. The private sector has also committed more than $120 billion in domestic EV and battery investments since President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law under a year ago. Car and truck companies moving to include more electric and other zero-emission vehicles in their products leads to an increasing diversity of clean vehicle choices for consumers. We know that Americans need and want flexibility in the types of vehicles they drive. The proposed standards are performance-based emission standards and are technology neutral, meaning that manufacturers can choose the mix of technologies, including internal combustion engines.
Mr. Kaufman, sorry.
Am I
You're
over?
You're way over. Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much.
And
gave you about a
thank you
minute
for the extra minute.
Okay, 18% more, right? Okay. I now recognize myself for the purpose of asking questions for 5 minutes. Mr. Kaufman, thank you again for being here today. Although I wish you were able to attend the hearing we had a month ago. I had to ask you, were you initially responsible for declining your invitation to appear before the committee, or did another EPA official make that decision for you?
Sorry. I participated in the decision.
And so that begs the question, I mean, you do recognize the fact that Congress has oversight over the EPA. Why,
Yes.
why didn't you testify? Why didn't
Yes.
you appear?
Sorry?
What was your reason for not appearing?
For my part, as with many things, it was primarily schedule.
So you couldn't change and adjust your schedule for the United States Congress?
It was difficult for me to do.
So what was more important?
Well, let me assure you, Mr. Chairman, that I am pleased to be here today. I understand that it's my obligation and commitment not only to be here today, but to continue to provide this committee and the Congress with the
Well, thank you, because
information.
I think this is just an institutional thing. I mean, for our chamber, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, I think it's absolutely, should be bipartisan, quite frankly, outrage. As a citizen of the United States, if I wasn't serving in Congress, I would want the EPA and all government, federal government agencies to appear before Congress when requested. Even during the comment period, Minister Reagan appeared before the ENC. So I would hope that in the future you would clear your calendar for Congress. I guess I think that's fair to say. Now, obviously, Mr. Kaufman, are you an elected official?
I am not.
Okay. When you were nominated, when were you nominated by the administration? Which month and year?
March 2022, and then again earlier this year, January of 2023.
So March of 2022. And last Congress, was your nominated reported favorably or unfavorably out of the Senate?
It was reported on a 10-10 vote from the Environment and Public Works Committee last year, and a 10
So by
vote
definition, that
this
would be
year.
unfavorable because it didn't pass.
I guess.
Okay. In 2.5 years, or I guess for a year and change, you've been operating in an acting capacity. Is that accurate?
I was in an acting capacity until November of 2021, and now I am just the principal deputy, but I'm
you're
responsible
unconfirmed.
for what the.
Are you
EPA
confirmed yet?
activities.
Have you been confirmed by the United States Senate?
No, I have not.
Okay. So, you know, the concern I have is when the EPA is passing major rules, and you're not elected, and the administrator, Reagan, he's not elected either, correct? How many employees is the EPA, roughly?
Roughly 15,000.
15, yeah, we said 17,000, so roughly. Any of them elected, of those 15 to 17,000?
No.
Okay. Which begs the question, then, why are y'all in effect legislating? Because, let's say, you have a law degree
Yes, I do.
from Yale?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. And you worked at Harvard? Is that
Yes.
right? So very prestigious. You're familiar with West Virginia versus EPA?
Yes, I am.
And SCOTUS, of course, some of their, you know, for lay people can be complicated rulings, but essentially, did they rule that the EPA acted within its statutory authority, or did they rule that the EPA overstepped their authority? In
The
that case?
latter.
The latter, so they overstepped their authority. How about Sackett versus EPA? Same question.
I'm less familiar with that.
Okay, but did they rule, are you familiar with, did the EPA act within their statutory authority, or did they exceed it? It was the waterways of the United States.
I'm generally familiar with the case. I'm hesitant because I haven't studied it.
Okay, well, I can
Studied West-
share with you that they also ruled that the EPA, again, overstepped their authority. So we have a pattern here about, say, the SCOTUS, the highest authority we have, has made it very clear that the EPA has exceeded their statutory authority, and they're making law when they don't have authority to do so. These are major and seismic decisions. So the EPA's proposed Clean Power Act Rule 2.0 would target emissions for coal and natural gas power plants, a sector that provides the U.S. with 60% of our electricity. At a Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources hearing last month, James Danley of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, testified that the intermittent renewable resources like wind and solar are simply incapable of ensuring the stability of the bulk electric system, and warns that if generation assets necessary to systemic stability are retired, there will be, and this is his quote, in time, a catastrophic reliability event. Did the EPA consult with FERC on how Clean Power Plan 2.0 would further impact the grid stability?
Yes, we did.
So can you commit to providing the committee with the communications and documents between the EPA and FERC to ensure the safety and soundness of the power grid should this proposal be finalized?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And my time is up, so I yield now to the ranking member. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. St. Louis and I are here today in defense of the planet itself. My Republican colleagues convene weekly hearings to question the merits and the efficacy of strong government relations under the jurisdiction of every single federal agency. Whether it be challenging sensible gun safety legislation or restricting the ability of the EPA to prevent corporations from polluting the very air we breathe, deregulation kills people. As we see in life-threatening and emergency situations like the tragic Titan submarine incident, the regulation of our transportation systems on land, air, or sea is a public safety concern. We don't look towards our investors or our bankers to step in when lives are on the line, but toward local, state, and federal governments. That's why we're here, to legislate and to regulate in the name of public safety. Let's remember what this hearing is really about. It's about the cars and the trucks most of us drive every day. We all agree that people need licenses to drive cars. They need license plates, inspections, seat belts, and other closely monitored regulations to protect the well-being of everyone on the road. The EPA has reported that in 2030 alone, the proposed rule to reduce emissions from fossil fuel fire power plants would, quote, prevent approximately 1,300 premature deaths and, quote, more than 300,000 cases of asthma attacks, which I previously stated. I refuse to prioritize the profits of a ruthless auto industry over our environment or the health of our communities. We have over 60 years of scientific evidence that proves historically segregated Black communities who live closer to transportation hubs like St. Louis are at higher risk of exposure to toxic air pollutants. In a groundbreaking March 2020 study published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology Letters, researchers found that in comparison with white people, Black and brown people reside near more smog and fine particulate matter from cars, from trucks, buses, and coal plants in areas that were historically redlined. Those pollutants inflame human airways, reduce lung function, trigger asthma attacks, and can cause damage to the heart and cause strokes. Black children, children of color, our seniors, people with disabilities, and those living outside without homes are all at risk. The implementation of these new EPA rules would be one important step towards achieving racial justice through direct climate action. Mr. Goffman, can you please discuss the disproportionate impact of unhealthy air quality on communities of color?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to that, Ranking Member Bush. We certainly know that pollutants like fine particles, for example, do have a disproportionate impact on the health of people of color, associated with a greater incidence of a range of respiratory diseases, including, for example, asthma in children. As you pointed out, something like 72 million people live very close to major highways and other transportation arteries. A disproportionate number of those people are people of color or people who live in low-income communities. Proposals like the one that we issued in April will go, we believe, a long way to protecting those very people from a wide range of the pollutants that are associated with their disproportionate encounters with heart disease, respiratory disease, and even cancer. And as you pointed out, that not only impairs the quality of their lives, it adds heavy costs as well.
Thank you. Mr. Goffman, can you please briefly explain why reducing pollutant emissions would have such a profound effect on just the people of this country at large?
Well, the power sector rules that we issued are a good example of response to your question, because through our proposal in May to set standards for CO2 emissions, our analysis shows that the emissions reductions of NOx, SOx, fine particles, even air toxics, as well as CO2, would be spread pretty evenly across the country, so that, as in the case with the car rules, everybody would benefit from those reductions and the resulting avoided illnesses and premature deaths linked to those.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Edwards from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goffman, thank you for being with us today. I'm excited to see that you did feel this hearing was important enough to attend. The EPA's EV rules would necessitate enormous investments from the auto industry, driving up the average price per vehicle for consumers. And additionally, electronic vehicles are already much more expensive than traditional autos with internal combustion engines. Mr. Goffman, EVs are much more expensive than gas-powered vehicles. Since they are, how do EPA's rules impact vehicle affordability for families?
Thank you, Congressman Edwards, for bringing that issue up, because it's a central preoccupation of ours as well. These rules won't deliver the benefits that we just talked about unless the vehicles are attractive, appealing, and above all, affordable. And so, among other things, we are working with the auto industry itself. Many companies have already made a significant commitment to marketing EVs, and we're learning from them about what they're doing to address affordability and what our rules need to do in order to support that. We're also putting these rules in proposal form out in the wake of Congress itself having, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, introduced into the economy a number of measures whose purpose and ultimate effect will be to make the manufacture of these vehicles less expensive, and therefore give the car companies the opportunity to sell the vehicles they're planning to market at affordable prices.
And so what are some of the things that you've learned that you could share with this committee that are going to make these more affordable? Because everything that I know right now shows that these vehicles are far more expensive on the American family.
Well, one of the things we've learned is the importance of lead time. We're here in 2023 having issued these proposals. We're working towards getting them into final. But one of the things we've learned from the companies is that they have already carefully mapped out business plans for the later years in this decade and the early years of 2030, the 2030s rather, to increasingly rely on EVs as part of their new car fleet, and that with that lead time and giving them the time to harvest the benefit of the investments that they're making that Congress has already made, they'll be able to bring prices down so that people can afford these vehicles. And the important thing from the agency's perspective is what we're learning is that we have to understand what they're doing so that these standards are structured in the same way. The proposal we put out actually presents 4 different alternative approaches so that we can continue to engage with the car companies, with other parts of the transportation sector in order to make sure that when we land these rules in final, it will reflect everybody's best understanding of how to make them how to make these vehicles affordable.
All right, thank you. Please excuse me if I seem a little bit skeptical that I'm not seeing anything, I'm not hearing anything, I'm certainly not seeing sticker prices on these vehicles be lowered to a point that families, at least in Western North Carolina, could afford them. There is, and please hear me clearly, there's a huge concern from the people that I represent for them being forced to buy a vehicle that is well out of their range. Many auto manufacturers expected to use the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles to pay for the transition to EVs. How would those rules affect that premise?
Well, one of the things we're seeing is that in the later part of this decade, when these rules start to phase in, companies will still be marketing well north of 40 million new internal combustion engine vehicles in their new car sales as this rule ramps up. And of course, under the proposal, the standards don't apply before model year 2027.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, I see I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the common sense regulations and rules put in place by the Environmental Protection Agency are prioritizing the health of our environment and our communities. We know the EPA is responsible for protecting the public from pollutants that might otherwise harm our health and negatively impact the environment, the climate. For example, the average levels of lead in blood of Americans has steadily dropped since the 1970s, when the EPA began to phase out leaded gasoline, which was banned entirely in 1995. That is just one effort among so many in which the EPA's rules and requirements have served to protect the health and well-being of our communities. To be clear, the presence of lead is still a major problem in communities like Cleveland, and we still have much work to do to remove lead and other pollutants from our air, water, and yes, pipes. But the Biden-Harris administration is working tirelessly to clean it all up, in particular thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's Lead, Pipe, and Paint Action Plan and investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. When we passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, it was a historic step towards combating the climate crisis while also addressing the pollution and pollutants that impact public health. In addition to lead, other emissions from burning fossil fuels are actively harmful to the public public, especially communities of color, which are repeatedly subjected to environmental injustices. Fortunately, we have agencies like the EPA playing a critical role in the fight to regulate those emissions and support healthier, longer, and better lives. So, Mr. Goffman, what progress has the Biden-Harris-led EPA made to lower pollution and emissions under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, among other policies?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act include a number of provisions that are already creating investments here in the United States for the components that auto manufacturers will need, not only to make cleaner cars and trucks, but to make them here and to make them at lower cost. So what we were doing with these proposals was, if you will, building upon those investments that Congress made in the first instance and now the private sector is making. What our rules do at the proposal stage, at least, they're designed to harness those investments so that 5 or 10 years from now, the cars and trucks that are being sold and coming onto the roadways will be much cleaner, not only operating with less or fewer CO2 emissions, but operating with fewer emissions of the whole range of pollutants that blight air quality and lead directly to avoidable illnesses and deaths. Here we are in year 3 of the first term of the administration. We've already finalized emission standards for both cars and trucks for model year 20 through model year 2026 for cars and for conventional pollutants from diesel engines and trucks. And these proposals build on those actions that we've already taken.
Thank you for that. And I would go on to say that, as we all know, Black and brown communities are disproportionately affected by both direct air pollution and the ramifications of climate change. I want to also say I remain committed to highlighting and confronting those disparities, and I continue to thank President Biden for emphasizing this as a part of his mission as well. Finally, Mr. Goffman, how does the EPA's rules ensure that all Americans, including communities of color, have clean air?
Well, thank you for that question. I think you know that Administrator Regan has made it a priority so that all of EPA's resources, whether they're providing funding to communities or writing standards that industry can comply with and achieve reductions, are designed in a way to provide benefits not just to some Americans, but to all Americans, including with a focus on those communities that already at this point in history have borne a greater burden of pollution and waste.
Thank you. I just want to say, although the EPA is under threat from the right-wing extremists, I'm grateful that the agency continues to work towards a cleaner future on behalf of the public, and I look forward to 30 years from now when we will view the phase-out of harmful pollutants and emissions as a common-sense measure to protect public health, similar to the ban on leaded gasoline. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Boebert from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goffman, are the EPA's rules to regulate light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles economically feasible for middle-class and hardworking American families living month to month and struggling with inflation?
Thank you for that question. It's a question that we take very seriously as well, and we've designed these rules to work hand in hand with the plans that we know that industry has to introduce and market clean
Mr. Goffman, what is the average price of a new combustion engine vehicle compared to the average price of a new electric vehicle?
I don't know the exact dollars. I know that today the EVs may be more expensive, but these rules.
So the average price of a traditional internal combustion engine was $45,600, while the average price of an electric vehicle was $61,800. And if these unfavorable rules are finalized, your own estimates that I've seen suggest 67% of all new cars sold in the U.S. will need to be fully electric by 2032. Now, how much did the average price of an electric vehicle increase by last year?
I don't know, but
So it's 22%. From May of 2022 to May of 2023, it's increased 22%. So it's not going down in price with these electric vehicles. We're seeing an increase. And by your own estimates, the technological costs of this proposal could reach $280 billion. That's increasing manufacturing costs by $1,200 per vehicle. Mr. Goffman, are you aware that in temperatures under 20 degrees Fahrenheit, electric vehicles lose nearly half of their charge in their batteries?
yes.
Yes. So in Colorado, where we rely on four-wheel drive vehicles to get around in winter, many of these vehicles will be regulated out of existence under these proposed rules. How much does an electric vehicle battery cost to replace?
I don't know offhand, but you're putting your finger on important issues, which is exactly why the strategy reflected in these rules is to give industry years of lead time. to address
Well, you're
these
regulating an industry out of existence here, and we're seeing that it's less reliable. In Colorado, it's very common to have temperatures under 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and these batteries will lose some of their charge. Now, I have between $5,000 and $20,000 to replace an electric vehicle's batteries. And prolonged exposure to temperatures under 20 degrees can also compromise the electric vehicle's battery performance as much as 41%. Now, how do you recommend that hardworking families who are struggling to get by absorb these additional costs associated with electric vehicles?
Well, our projection is that by the time these rules go into effect, both the industry and investments like those made in the IRA and the
So we're just going to print more money to make up for that. So, I mean, we're seeing a 22% increase in 1 year for the cost of electric vehicles. Even the tires on an electric vehicle wear 20% faster. I don't think that the average American taxpayer is looking for another federal government bailout for tires. I mean, over half of Americans have less than $1,000 in their savings account, and you're wanting them to spend more money on vehicles where the price is increasing, be at 41% higher at risk for having to change out a battery, tires that wear 20% faster than your average car. Now, please name 2 domestic mines that you support, Mr. Goffman, and that are critical to helping produce the amount of minerals necessary for the electric vehicles you've been praising today.
Well, the information I have is that in just under a year since the IRA was passed, 75 new facilities have been started to...
Domestic mines?
Including domestic mining.
Can you name any?
No,
that you support?
not offhand. I'd be happy to get behind.
So the Rosemont mine and the Resolution Copper mine are 2 mines in Arizona blocked by the environmental extremists and the federal bureaucrats that would produce massive amounts of copper in the United States. The Biden administration has also blocked the Twin Metals mine in northern Minnesota, and Democrats on the Natural Resources Committee oppose all domestic mining. And if we don't mine for these minerals necessary, where are they going to come from? The 40,000 children mining for cobalt in the Congo with their bare hands in these China-owned mines, and then we buy these products from China and somehow feel virtuous about ourselves while they're building some 200 coal-fired energy plants. These rules do not benefit the hardworking Americans that I represent, and I hope that you would reconsider them and the costs that the American family is going to have to absorb because of them. My time has expired, and I yield.
Chair recognizes Ms. Stansbury from New Mexico.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to hold yet another hearing on electric vehicles, and a delight to have the second opportunity to have the exact same hearing we had a couple of weeks ago. This definitely seems to be becoming a habit of the Oversight Committee. When the majority doesn't get the answers that they want, they just have the hearing again and then beat up another witness. And I do want to just say thank you, Mr. Goffman, for being here this morning. The EPA is always a popular punching bag of our friends on the other side of the aisle, and we all know the devastating impact that the Trump administration had on the EPA, and especially the morale of all of our federal employees. So I want to thank you and all of our EPA employees who are sitting here with us today, and all of them who are serving across the country to protect our environment, because we know that you're doing the work of the American people. We know that you're doing the work that the American people elected us in this body to do, which is to protect clean air, to protect clean water, and to ensure that all of our families have a livable planet for generations to come. So, we're here today to talk about climate change, to talk about this vehicle rule, and to talk about the actions that the federal government is taking to invest in the private sector and the public sector to make sure that we address this existential and catastrophic threat to all of humanity across the planet. And, one of the reasons why I welcome the opportunity to have this hearing again is that it gives us another opportunity to highlight the important work that this Congress, last Congress, passed in passing the most significant climate legislation ever in the history of the planet, and that is the Inflation Reduction Act, and the work that the Biden administration is doing through our federal agencies to carry out the mandates that are in the Clean Air Act, that are in the Clean Water Act, and in the Inflation Reduction and bipartisan infrastructure laws to actually address our carbon emissions. And I think one of the things that folks really need to understand is that if we are going to address our carbon emissions and prevent a catastrophic climate calamity from affecting every single community on this planet, we have to do it sector by sector. We have to address it in the grid. We have to address it in domestic energy security. We have to address it through building materials. And that's exactly what the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act do. And in particular, we have to address it in the transportation sector, because transportation makes up about 29% of our emissions here in the United States. Now, there was some comments made earlier about EPA overstepping its authority in terms of setting out emission standards under the Clean Air Act. And while there was an unprecedented gutting of federal authority by a political Supreme Court a few weeks ago in Sackett and in a previous Clean Air Act decision, we all know, those of us who've worked in environmental policy, myself included, that the intent of Congress when they passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act was to protect American citizens, to protect our air, to protect our water, and that they intended, in a bipartisan basis, when both of those bills passed in Congress, and in the case of the Clean Water Act, were signed by a Republican president, to ensure that the American people would have a livable, breathable, drinkable, clean planet for future generations. And so it is just patently false that the EPA has overstepped their authority. Now, with respect to this current rule, this is really about addressing that slice of the pie in the transportation sector. And so, Mr. Goffman, I wonder if you could just take one moment to please explain the significance of why we have to address it in the transportation sector and how this feeds into our overall efforts to combat climate change here in the U.S.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman, for doing as good a job as I've ever heard anybody do in laying out the entire vision of what it will take to address not just climate change, but public health and air quality. In your question, you provided exactly the context for these rules, which are but one of several pillars on which a new car, clean car fleet of on-highway vehicles is being built. What this set of proposals will do is work in an integrated way with the investments made by the Inflation Reduction Act and in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in the whole range of innovations and deployments of technologies that will allow us to travel on road, delivering freight and transporting passengers in a way that significantly reduces pollutants like CO2. We project that these proposals, if enacted, would achieve close to, or certainly in excess of 9 billion tons of CO2 reduced, which is close to twice 2020.
Sorry, Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll just say, once again, thank you. This is a critical piece in fighting climate change, and we appreciate your service.
Chair recognizes Ms. Luna from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Goffman, thank you for coming in today. Just out of curiosity, have you ever owned a business? Sorry? Have you ever owned a business?
I have not.
How long have you been in this position?
My current position?
Yes, or at the EPA?
2.5 years in this position.
Okay, and what did you do previously?
I worked at Harvard Law School.
What did you do there?
I was the executive director of a legal research program.
Okay, and you were there for how long?
3 years.
Okay. Have you ever been to Anchorage, Alaska?
No, I have not.
Have you ever evacuated a hurricane in Florida?
No, I have not.
Okay. And my final question, a little bit more personal, but how much do you make a year? I know it's kind of random, but I'm going somewhere with this.
About $175,000 a year.
Oh my gosh, you're doing better than I think we are after taxes, right, guys? Anyways, the reason I ask that is because right now what I'm seeing is the EPA, not necessarily you, but as a whole, people advising on legislation that's impacting Americans who might not be as fortunate as us, right? So right now, the average cost of an electric vehicle is around $66,000 a year. You have Black Americans' average income, $45K a year, and Hispanic Americans on average making about $58K a year. So when these policies go into place to force someone to buy a new vehicle, ultimately what ends up happening is many people can't afford that. Places like Anchorage, Alaska, I had the opportunity of being able to go out on a CODEL recently. And, you know, what I'm hearing from out there is they do rely on gas-powered vehicles, especially because of the environment that they're in. And in an event like in Florida, when you've had to evac, we can't necessarily rely on electric vehicles because of the fact that, one, Florida's a very big state, and also to the fact that there's not enough charging stations, nor is there the infrastructure in place to, I think, provide the support needed for an entirely electric grid, not to mention that there's a national security issue that goes hand in hand with that because of the fact that if the electric grid is hacked, ultimately what ends up happening is it can shut down our entire country, and that's something that I'm sure that you would even agree is a bad thing, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So my question for you is, what is the EPA doing to actually talk to normal people, people not in Washington, people not at Harvard, people not in Congress, to ensure that they're being taken care of? Because these policies, this legislation, not only is it going to impact jobs, not only will it really attack the economy, but it's going to hurt Americans. So are you guys doing any outreach to actual normal people to see if they agree with any of this legislation?
Thank you for that question. Engaging with everybody, if you will, is an absolute priority whenever we undertake rulemakings like this. We talk to industry, we talk to our co-regulators in states, and we definitely arrange to meet with people in communities across the country on a number of our rules. And what we hear the most from the people we talk to is that reducing pollution in their communities is a top priority.
I mean, I think everyone wants a clean community, but the problem is that if you have people in poverty because of laws that aren't necessarily reflective of the areas that they live in, that's going to cause more issues long term. then I think what we can do, not only to promote clean energy, which would be, in my opinion, nuclear energy, but then also to making sure that we're not sending our industries to places that don't respect the environment, and thus, regardless of what we do here, for example, in some of these Asian countries, they might be destroying the environment, so it doesn't matter what we do here. I have a question about Toyota Auto Corporation. It's estimated that about 1.2 million public chargers by 2030 is what is needed. That's about $400 per day. How many public chargers are going to be going online per day right now?
What I do know is that in the last couple of years, there was a 40% increase in chargers, which now bring us up to a total of 130,000 chargers.
Do you know how many per day are going up? Because right now, to hit those metrics, it would need to be about 400 per day.
I don't know how many are going up, but I do know that Congress passed 2 significant pieces of legislation that will boost the deployment of chargers.
Okay,
The
my final.
private sector is making significant investments as well.
Okay, my final statement, because I'm short on time, is like, look, I know you're in a very important position, but I just hope that you're taking into account people that might not necessarily have the resources when you guys are making these decisions, because it's going to impact a lot of people and it's going to hurt Americans.
Understood.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Christian Morthy from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Mr. Goffman for coming in. Couple quick questions. One is, I'm ranking member of this new committee in Congress dedicated to kind of winning the competition against the Chinese Communist Party. And this select committee is looking at the EV industry, in particular as an area where the Chinese dominate the global electric vehicle industry. How, if at all, would your rules help us in competing against the Chinese with regard to this crucial EV industry of the future?
Thank you for that question, because the competition you describe is a tremendous opportunity for America to expand its leadership in clean technologies. It's an opportunity that I think we as a country have already seized. It's reflected in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And these rules are part of the greater, if I can put it this way, the greater fabric of the strategy to build out investment here in the United States in every part of what it takes to create a zero-emitting fleet on American roads.
And I sense that there's broad concern about the cost of electric vehicles being so high. That has to come down for average, ordinary people to be able to access them. But would you agree that the only way that the cost per car can actually go down is through economies of scale? That means making a lot of these with over a certain period of time so that on a per unit basis, they go down in price.
That sounds to me, from what you just said, Congressman, exactly what the strategy of the major auto manufacturers is. 2.5 years ago, or 2 years ago, the Detroit 3 announced a commitment to selling 50% EVs by 2030. And at least one of those companies followed up that announcement last fall by saying that its commitment was to make 100% new car EVs by 2035.
Was that General Motors?
General Motors, yeah. And that seems to be perfectly aligned with what you described.
So what you're saying is you're describing what the private sector is already doing.
Correct.
I met with GM CEO Mary Barra yesterday in Detroit, along with Mike Gallagher, my chairman, and several bipartisan members of this committee. Detroit is already ahead of the game. They are already doing what you are prescribing within these rules. So the question to me is this: how else do these rules help us? It appears that it helps to reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And why is that important? Why is it so important to reduce those emissions in the time frame that you have indicated?
Well, it's important for several reasons. First of all, these rules again, work in partnership with the investments that Congress has already made, so that what we're creating is not only by we I mean the administration and Congress, is very powerful incentives to support what the private sector is planning to do. But these rules actually provide the American public with assurance that they will see the emissions reductions that we will get as we put more and more cleaner and cleaner cars on the road.
I would
in a
just-
time frame when people today are suffering significant air quality related health problems, and the buildup of greenhouse gases like CO2 in the atmosphere is programming in increased weather disruption and climate disruption.
Now, you have proposed you've proposed a rule, just as any administration does with regard to rulemaking, and you invite comments.
Correct.
As part of this process. Are you willing to potentially adjust any part of this rule based on the comments that you receive either from individuals, entities, anyone affected in this process?
We've designed the proposal to capitalize on the opportunity that commenters will provide us. What we laid out is not just one approach. We laid out 4 different approaches, and we're counting on using that as a framework to engage with stakeholders, the public, states, and the industry, so that when we finalize these rules, the approach we do adopt will achieve all of the objectives that everybody this morning spoke to.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony.
Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Bush for a close.
Thank you, Chairman. Just like the last hearing on this topic, Republicans have focused heavily on the supposed cost of these regulations on consumers when their real concern is the cost of compliance for fossil fuel companies. As the EPA has testified, these regulations will save money for consumers. More importantly, these regulations will reduce greenhouse gas and other pollutant emissions to help tackle, bless you, to help tackle the climate. So we're trying to help. And improve public health. As we've heard, these new standards will help avoid millions of metric tons of carbon pollution, as well as save hundreds of lives. These regulations are based on the innovations of the auto industry. The Environmental Protection Agency's proposed emission standards, as people would call ambitious, they are yet attainable and support industry and consumers as we move toward more fuel-efficient and electric vehicles. And if I sound like a broken record, it's only because we keep having the same hearing week in and week out. Nearly every hearing on this subcommittee has taken aim at the actions of the Biden administration, and the Biden administration has what they've done to move us closer towards a cleaner, more sustainable energy. Republicans' continued attack on the Biden administration's regulatory process risks exacerbating our community's exposure to worsening climate change and health risks, both of which have outsized negative impacts on Black and brown communities. The climate crisis is here, it's now, and we have no time to waste. Congress must do everything we can to drastically reduce our emissions so the planet can continue to survive for our children and our grandchildren. The EPA is doing just that by introducing these rules to curb the emissions of pollutants from vehicles and power plants, 2 of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. I thank them for doing this work to protect our planet and our people. And as someone who knows people who have lost children during asthma attacks because of those complications, as someone who has had patients die from asthma attacks, all of those patients and all of the people I speak of are Black. As someone who lives with asthma every single day and has almost lost her life from it, this deregulation kills. It harms our communities, and we must do everything to make sure our communities are safe. Thank you, and I yield back.
So I want to be clear about a few things. We wouldn't have had a second hearing. We wouldn't be here today if the witness had agreed to testify a month ago, number one. 2, trusting folks in industries like car manufacturing, Toyota, for example, said that they can produce 90 hybrid vehicles and the rare earth minerals that takes, or they can produce, with those rare earth minerals, one electric car. What's better for the environment? Clearly to have 90 hybrids out there than the one electric vehicle. And I'm also dismayed that there was absolutely no outrage whatsoever from our friends across the aisle that the EPA chose not to testify a month ago. Because, so it's terribly unhealthy, and it sets a dangerous precedent. Right now, we have a GOP-controlled House overseeing Democratic federal agencies. There will be a day that comes when we have a Democratic House overseeing GOP federal agencies. And I would assume that there was going to be outrage then. But because the precedent's been set that apparently that's just okay that folks don't clear their calendars for Congress when they work for federal agencies.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, real quick, go ahead.
It's not that Democrats understand that there was going to be another hearing. Thank you.
We wouldn't have had that second hearing if he had chosen to testify. So again, and to be respectful, I did not interrupt you, nor do I huff and puff when you speak. I listen respectfully, and I would expect the same. We have, so. There was no outrage. And then deregulation, this is some of the quotes that I heard. Deregulation kills people, we make people sick, there's lives on the line, and there's 60 years of evidence, and we're right-wing extremists. I mean, it's the same old script, it's just a different chapter. But the problem is that a lot of that is not true when you look at empirical scientific evidence. Everyone has benefited from technological advancements that have been fueled by the energy sector. For instance, if you look at the life expectancy of Americans in 1900, so let's look at 1900. The carbon dioxide emissions worldwide were 1.95 billion metric tons. Today, well, in 2021, it was 37 billion metric tons, 19 times more. So people must have been healthier in 1900. The average life expectancy of an American in 1900 was 47 years of age. For African Americans, that comprised 95% of the non-white population at the time, it was only 33 years of age, which is just heart-wrenching. So whites lived 42% longer than blacks in 1900. In 2019, life expectancy, with all that carbon in the air, for whites was 79 years of age in this country, and for African Americans, it was 75 years of age. So instead of a 42% gap, it was 5%, a drastic reduction and a wonderful trend for parity. But then, interestingly enough, if you look at folks that make it to 70 years of age, believe it or not, African Americans live slightly longer than whites that reach that age. And at 85, it's 50%. Black folks that reach 85 years of age live 50% longer at that point than white folks. Just interesting. So we have agencies like FERC saying that we're risking catastrophic failures in our grid. And catastrophic, by definition, is a momentous, tragic event ranging from extreme misfortune to utter overthrow or ruin. We have to have our agencies working together and be responsible to Congress. That was something that should have been completely bipartisan. But again, we heard no outrage whatsoever. And then, as always, it doesn't seem like anyone wants to recognize on the other side of the aisle that the United States is trending in the right direction. We are doing good things because we are responsible caretakers. And we have to find balance. Because the people that whine and moan about too much carbon emission have carbon footprints themselves. I don't see anybody weaving their own clothing from hemp. You have combustion engine vehicles, flying airplanes, and enjoy these advancements. And our country has reduced our carbon emissions in the last 20 years by over 20%. But our greatest political rival, China, seems rather callous. to their carbon emissions and have increased their carbon emissions by 300%. So where, again, is the picketing at Chinese consulates and embassies? Where are the Democrats in this Congress that mention that? Doesn't seem to happen, and that's unfortunate. Well, again, I wish we hadn't had to have this hearing again, because we all are busy, but the EPA decided that, you know, they had more important things to do than testify in front of Congress, and I hope that never happens again, whether it's the EPA or any other federal agency, and whether the Republicans are in charge of Congress or the Democrats are, because this is about the process, and it's about the institution, and it's about the American people. We are their elected representatives. Thank you. And with that, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for witnesses, which will be forwarded to witnesses for their response. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.